They were Rome's pride, the Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana. Hardened in the crucible of conquest, they fought under Julius Caesar in Gaul, crushed rebellions in Hispania, and secured Rome's grip on the frontier. Over 5,000 elite soldiers, an unstoppable force of imperial will.
For nearly 2,000 years, they were a ghost story in the Roman record. Legio IX Hispana, the elite Ninth Legion, vanished without explanation after AD 120. No battlefield, no scrolls, no graves, just silence. Historians guessed Scotland, Judea, or quiet reassignment. But in 25, a breakthrough changed everything. A remote Scottish hillside, a drone scan, and a buried camp revealed the truth. They weren't transferred. They were slaughtered and erased. What followed wasn't just archaeological revelation. It was proof of political cover-up, cultural fracture, and Rome's darkest fear. Soldiers who stopped believing. At last, we know what happened and why they were forgotten. The Ninth Legion's legacy. In the grand mosaic of Roman military history, few names gleam with as much distinction and mystery as Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Legion. Formed around 65 BC, it was born into the chaos of the late Roman Republic and quickly rose to prominence under the iron command of Julius Caesar himself. From the muddy fields of Gaul to the war-scarred plains of Hispania, the Ninth became known for its relentless discipline and brutal effectiveness. They were no ordinary soldiers. They were the hammer Caesar used to strike fear into the rebellious Gallic tribes, and later the shield against uprisings in the West. When Emperor Claudius launched his historic invasion of Britain in AD 43, the Ninth was among the vanguard, crossing treacherous waters and facing an unfamiliar land. Their reputation only grew as they subdued fierce tribes like the Brigantes in northern Britain. By AD 71, they were stationed at Eboracum, modern-day York. But they weren't just warriors, they were also builders. The Ninth helped establish roads, gates, barracks, and Roman civic structures that still whisper their presence in stone and soil. Their reach extended beyond conquest. They left behind the physical architecture of empire. Some historians have described them as an elite unit, not simply for their military record, but for their ability to endure. They survived the Boudiccan uprising, holding firm as towns burned and legions buckled. Tales of their resilience traveled across the empire, carving their name into Roman legend. And then, suddenly, they were gone. No poetic fall, no glorious last stand in the pages of official Roman history, just silence. They appear alive and present, one moment in the record books, and then the trail goes cold. No triumphant return, no known redeployment, no proper memorial. Only a gap, a void so curious it sparked generations of speculation. Did they fall in Scotland? Were they transferred and absorbed? Were they destroyed or erased? For centuries, the Ninth's fate became one of Rome's greatest historical enigmas, and the absence of answers was almost as loud as the Legion's once thunderous march. That moment of vanishing sets the stage for one of the most chilling chapters in ancient military history. The moment history went quiet. Their last known footprint is precise. A stone inscription unearthed in Eboracum, dated around AD 107-108, confirms the Ninth Legion's presence in Britain. It records routine activity, nothing out of place. A building project, a mention of ranks. Then, nothing. After that, the Ninth disappears from British records entirely. No orders of transfer, no reports of reassignment, no inscriptions elsewhere in the empire bearing their full title. It's as if the parchment of Roman history simply skipped a line, erasing a name once so proudly displayed. By the time Hadrian's Wall began construction just a few years later, the Ninth is no longer mentioned among the participating forces, nor do they appear in military rosters from the reign of Emperor Severus nearly a century later. For a unit of such fame, this silence was deafening. Roman bureaucracy was notoriously meticulous, especially regarding military movements. So the Ninth's sudden disappearance from inscriptions, stone markers, and official records wasn't merely an oversight. It was conspicuous absence. Deliberate or otherwise, something had scrubbed them from memory. In a world obsessed with order, where even border mile markers were etched in Latin permanence. The Ninth's vanishing act became a riddle historians couldn't stop circling. Were they lost in battle, quietly disbanded, redeployed eastward to die in another forgotten war? Centuries later, this void gave rise to a dozen theories. Some believed they marched north into Scotland, met a brutal fate at the hands of unrecorded tribal forces, and were left unburied in the bog. Others argued they were transferred to Nijmegen in the Roman Netherlands, broken into detachments, and absorbed without ceremony. A few even suggested they died far from Britain, crushed in the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea or the grinding attrition of the Parthian War. But the problem wasn't the theories, it was the lack of proof. Archaeologists unearthed camps, coins, and pottery, but never enough to confirm their fate. The Ninth had become more than a missing legion. They became a symbol of erasure, of how empires forget their failures, of how a name can survive in rumor long after it's gone from the record. And for almost 2,000 years, that was all we had: speculation, silence, and the echo of boots that vanished into the mist. Until now, because in 2020, a twist of fate and a stroke of science would break open the silence and solve one of Rome's oldest mysteries: wartime theories and debates. For centuries, historians filled the silence left by the Ninth Legion with speculation. With no definitive record of their fate, theories multiplied, each trying to explain how an entire Roman legion could disappear without a trace. The most popular theory, dating back to 19th century historian Theodore Mommsen, held that the Ninth marched north into Caledonia, modern Scotland, and never returned. The idea of a devastating ambush by fierce tribal warriors in unfamiliar terrain was compelling. A proud Roman unit, lured too far from its support lines, surrounded and destroyed in brutal fashion. The romanticism of a lost legion dying in the misty highlands captured imaginations for generations. But not everyone agreed. Some scholars pointed to evidence suggesting the legion had been transferred to the continent, specifically to the Roman frontier in Nijmegen, in what is now the Netherlands. There, fragments of inscriptions hinted at the presence of a unit bearing the Ninth's designation, although never conclusively. This led to another theory. The Ninth wasn't destroyed, just relocated and eventually merged into other forces. Others proposed the legion had been shipped further east, possibly to Judea, where it was lost during the Bar Kokhba revolt around AD 132. That conflict was brutal and underreported. A legion could conceivably vanish there, especially one already weakened by years of attrition. Still others believed the Ninth met its end in the Parthian War around AD 161, a disastrous campaign deep in enemy territory, far from Roman support. The theory goes that the legion was quietly disbanded after suffering massive losses, its remnants absorbed into other units. But every one of these theories had a problem: lack of proof, no battlefield, no mass grave, no solid inscriptions, no recovered eagle standard, the sacred emblem carried by every Roman legion. Without these, the Ninth's fate remained conjecture, a mystery of whispers and guesswork. And yet, in all of these debates, a troubling pattern emerged. The Ninth wasn't just missing, they were omitted. Unlike other legions that fell in battle, like those lost in the Teutoburg forest, whose defeat was mourned and memorialized, the Ninth was never publicly acknowledged as lost. It was as if the empire had chosen to forget them. That choice, that silence, would become more suspicious over time. Why would Rome bury this loss? What was it about the Ninth's end that had to be erased? These questions simmered for centuries. And then, in the cold Scottish winter of January 2025, an accidental discovery would change everything. The 2025 breakthrough, by accident. It wasn't a grand expedition or a targeted archaeological mission. It was routine. An AI-guided drone survey, part of a Scottish environmental research project scanning for ancient farming patterns. But what it found deep beneath the soil in a remote stretch of highland terrain would rewrite Roman history. The drone's LiDAR imaging revealed something unnatural: an enormous rectangular grid faintly outlined beneath layers of peat and stone. The layout didn't match any local settlement. It was too orderly, too geometric. What it did match was a Roman marching camp. Over 20 hectares in size, enough space to hold roughly 5,000 soldiers. The configuration was textbook: internal roads, defensive ditches, corner watchtowers. But what stood out were signs of panic: hastily dug outer earthworks, irregular ditching, fortifications designed for speed, not permanence. Archaeologists mobilized quickly. Excavations began in February 2025. Within weeks, they unearthed a scene of silent violence: shattered shields, spearheads bent in place, thousands of hobnails from Roman military boots, scattered in uneven clusters, broken swords, charred timbers from burned palisades, and more chillingly, personal effects: insignia fragments, uniform clasps, belt buckles bearing the unmistakable imprint, Legio IX Hispana. This wasn't a camp, it was a final stand. Carbon dating placed the artifacts between AD 117 and 120, the exact period when the Ninth vanished from British records. The site bore all the hallmarks of a catastrophic event: rushed fortification, no signs of retreat, and no evidence of later reuse. This wasn't a reassignment, this was an ambush. It was the first real proof that the Ninth didn't disappear into paperwork. They were erased in blood, and the precision of their destruction, so complete, so final, hinted at something more than battlefield chaos. It hinted at intent. But if this was truly their last stand, one question remained: why did Rome stay silent? Confirming the Ninth's fate. The site was undeniable. As excavation deepened in early 2025, more relics of Legio IX Hispana emerged from the frozen Scottish soil: pieces of military harnesses, rank insignias, and broken ceremonial standards, all bearing the Ninth's unmistakable symbols. Forensic experts stepped in to confirm what archaeologists already suspected. This was no auxiliary outpost. It was a Roman legionary stronghold, hastily fortified and violently destroyed. The soil preserved the violence in chilling detail. Skeletal remains bore the marks of chaotic combat: slashing wounds, crushed ribs, embedded arrowheads. Shield fragments were warped by force. Defensive ditches had been flooded with blood and debris. Carbon dating of wooden fragments from the camp's gatehouses placed the event between AD 117 and 120, right in the gap where the Ninth vanished from all official record. But the most damning evidence lay in what wasn't there. There were no signs of retreat, no fallback lines, no reoccupation layers. Whatever happened here, it was sudden and final. The camp had been overrun and then left. Never cleaned up, never documented, just erased. Roman camps, even in defeat, typically left administrative traces: a letter to a provincial governor, burial honors, names etched into stone. But this site had none of that. It was a ghost of a legion, as if the empire itself had wanted to forget. Even more striking was the absence of reused materials. Local tribes often scavenged fallen forts for iron, stone, or timber, but this site remained untouched, suggesting the area had become taboo, sacred or cursed. A burial of memory, not just men, and it changed everything. Until now, scholars had argued over whether the Ninth was transferred, merged, or quietly retired. But this find destroyed those notions. This wasn't disbandment, it was extermination. For Rome, this wasn't just a military loss, it was an ideological breach. The Ninth hadn't died in an imperial center or on foreign soil. It had died within Britain's borders, on the very frontier they were meant to hold. And the silence surrounding it now seemed deliberate, because for an empire obsessed with triumph, admitting the fall of one of its most celebrated legions on Roman soil at the edge of a barbarian world was unthinkable. That silence, it turns out, wasn't forgetfulness. It was a cover-up. Political cover-up and erasure. In the Roman world, even failure had ritual. When 3 legions were destroyed by Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest, the empire mourned them for decades. Memorials were raised, names remembered, eagles retrieved at great cost. Even in defeat, Rome found ways to reaffirm its pride. But for the Ninth, nothing. No public mourning, no imperial inscriptions, no reconstituted titles. The legion simply vanished, not only from stone and scroll, but from memory itself. Historians had long found this omission troubling. But now, with the 25 discovery confirming a brutal end in Scotland, a more disturbing question surfaced. Why would Rome choose not to remember? The answer, scholars believe, lies not in what the Ninth did on the battlefield, but in what they might have become. Shortly after the battlefield was confirmed, researchers revisited overlooked archival documents, senatorial communications, provincial correspondences, and command logs from AD 117-125. Buried among them were veiled references to an unauthorized northern campaign and an incident involving ideological contagion among the troops. One phrase stood out: behavioral divergence noted within the Ninth. This was not ordinary battlefield failure. This was internal rot, possibly rebellion, or at least deep sympathy with the local population. If the Ninth had grown disillusioned, or worse, fractured in loyalty, their destruction may have been less a tragedy and more a purge. Political stability in the empire depended on the unquestioned loyalty of its legions. The possibility that a decorated Roman force had defied command or fraternized with northern tribes would have been more dangerous than military defeat. So instead of memorializing the loss, Rome did what all great powers do when confronted with internal contradiction. They buried it. No statues, no scrolls, no acknowledgement. To preserve the illusion of imperial control, the Ninth wasn't remembered as a cautionary tale. It was erased as an embarrassment. And for nearly 2 millennia, that strategy worked. The silence was so total, the cover-up so complete, that even professional historians dismissed the Ninth's fate as uncertain. Until a drone's accidental scan tore the lie from the soil. The mystery wasn't that they disappeared. It's that they were made to. Unearthed scrolls and Senate secrets. The battlefield evidence painted a violent, chaotic end, but it was the written record, long overlooked, that revealed something more chilling: intentional silence. In the months following the 2025 archaeological discovery, academic institutions across Europe began re-examining archived Roman scrolls, many of which had been cataloged decades ago, but never fully translated or contextualized. Among them were several documents stored in the Vatican Library, the British Museum, and smaller university collections in Germany and Italy. Most were mundane, routine senatorial discussions, imperial decrees, logistical records, but a handful dated between AD 117 and 125 stood out. They referenced troop deployments north of Iberacum, but more tellingly, they didn't mention the Ninth by name. Instead, they used vague terms like the unit operating beyond imperial instruction, or legion, no longer under coordinated directive. One scroll, translated from its fragile Latin parchment, read, "Let no formal recognition be granted to the failed endeavor beyond the second line. Cultural deviance observed. Instructions issued, dissolve and strike from rolls." Another, from a senatorial session, included the phrase, "Ideological deviation with native tribes noted. Contagion must not spread." That word, contagion, sent chills through the scholarly community. It suggested that the Ninth didn't just die in battle. They may have embraced the people they were meant to subdue, or perhaps, at the very least, had begun to question the empire they represented. In the eyes of Roman leadership, that was far worse than defeat. These weren't just soldiers lost in hostile territory. They were a symbol of imperial vulnerability, a reminder that Roman identity was never fully secure, that cultural loyalty could fracture, that the line between occupier and assimilator could blur. Rome's solution? Erase the evidence, strip the legion from public memory, label them not as heroes, not even as failures, but as a virus to be contained. The scrolls confirmed it. The Ninth wasn't simply forgotten, they were deliberately struck from history. And that's what made their final resting place, discovered just weeks later, even more haunting. Forensic finale, mass grave discovered. In May 2025, less than 5 kilometers from the ambushed Roman camp, a second site was detected, smaller, deeper, and eerily quiet. What was first thought to be a quarry was, in fact, a mass burial trench. The trench held over 400 skeletons, buried in overlapping rows, tightly packed and positioned unnaturally. Many were bound, arms behind backs, legs crossed. Some were kneeling, heads missing. Others showed signs of blunt force trauma, ritualistic wounds, and deliberate mutilation. There was no attempt at Roman funerary rites. This wasn't a battlefield burial. It was an execution site. Forensic analysis identified the remains as overwhelmingly male, ages 20 to 40, military prime. Many bore signs of malnutrition or exhaustion. Some had injuries consistent with earlier battles. And embedded in the layers of soil were unmistakable markers: hobnails, belt fittings, fragments of military insignia. Enough to confirm affiliation with Legio IX Hispana. And then they found the eagle, broken in half, its wings scorched, the shaft buried upside down beneath the corpses. A symbolic desecration, the ultimate rejection of Rome's claim over them. This wasn't just defeat, it was annihilation. Psychological, spiritual, and symbolic. The configuration suggested ritualized violence, a purge not just of a legion, but of what they may have become. Soldiers who perhaps abandoned imperial ideology, men who crossed a line. Whether the executioners were local tribes, rival legions, or agents of Rome itself remains uncertain. But the message was unmistakable. These men were to be erased, not as warriors, but as traitors. Forensic teams concluded the site had been intentionally concealed. Over time, layers of turf and peat had sealed it from history. Not one Roman text mentioned it. No map marked it. It was buried not just in soil, but in purposeful silence. Now, with the Ninth Legion's fate finally revealed, the story was no longer about a military mystery. It was about a cultural reckoning, a confrontation with how empires handle dissent, from outside and from within. Rewriting Roman history. The discoveries of 2025 didn't just settle a mystery, they detonated it. In a matter of weeks, what had been centuries of speculation about the Ninth Legion's fate transformed into a moment of historical reckoning. No longer was Legio IX Hispana a tantalizing question mark in Roman military lore. It was now a documented tragedy, rooted not just in battlefield loss, but in systemic erasure. The evidence was overwhelming. The ambushed camp, the mass grave, the inscribed artifacts, and the sealed scrolls all aligned. And in June 2025, a joint academic team from Oxford University and Scottish Archaeological Institutes published their landmark study, The Legion That Rome Forgot. It formally concluded what many had suspected, but none had proved. Legio IX Hispana was destroyed in northern Britain around AD 120. Not merely lost, but deliberately wiped from memory. The findings swept through academic circles. Military historians began re-evaluating assumptions about Roman loyalty, discipline, and control. Anthropologists reconsidered Rome's cultural influence on frontier legions, how integration with local tribes might have blurred lines of allegiance. Political scholars found echoes of the Ninth story in modern patterns of military censorship, institutional cover-ups, and narrative control. The Ninth had not been disbanded with dignity. They had been extinguished, then erased. Exhibits were updated in museums across Britain, Italy, and the Netherlands. What once presented the Ninth as an unresolved puzzle now told a story of internal collapse, a cautionary tale of imperial overreach and the dangers of controlling a story by deleting it. But the reaction wasn't limited to academic halls. In Scotland, where the ambush site lay, the discovery became a rallying point. Local leaders embraced it not just as archaeological victory, but as cultural validation. The defeat of the Ninth was reframed as a symbol of indigenous resistance, proof that the Roman machine, for all its might, had bled into the highlands and been broken. Educational campaigns began reframing the Roman narrative not as an unstoppable force, but as a flawed system held together by loyalty, and sometimes lost by ideology. In classrooms, the Ninth was no longer just another legion. It was a story about what happens when soldiers stop believing in the empire they serve. And in the ruins and records unearthed from ancient peat, a voice long silenced had finally spoken again. Legacy restored, the harsh lesson. The mystery is solved. The men of the Ninth Legion, once thought missing, perhaps transferred, perhaps mythical, were found. They didn't vanish into legend. They died. They were surrounded, ambushed, and crushed. Then they were buried, first in the ground and then in deliberate silence. Their erasure wasn't an accident. It was a policy. Rome, ever obsessed with its image, chose to forget them. No inscriptions, no ceremonies, no reconstitution of the unit. Where other legions lost in battle were honored in marble and verse, the Ninth was treated like a contagion, a warning best unspoken. But history, as it always does, remembered. Not through the monuments built by emperors, but through the traces left by ordinary soldiers. Fragments of belts, shields, standard poles buried in ashen soil. Through scrolls that slipped through imperial censors. Through bones that refused to disappear. In the end, it was not the empire that told their story. It was data. It was forensics. It was the land itself, quietly preserving what politics tried to erase. And so, the Ninth's legacy lives, not as conquerors, not even as martyrs, but as a case study in how power responds to failure, how truth is sometimes not lost, but hidden, and how silence can be louder than 1,000 statues. It's a bitter legacy, but it's also a lesson. Empires fall not only when they are attacked, but when they begin to erase the parts of themselves they fear. And history does not always remember what a civilization celebrates. Sometimes it remembers what it tried to forget. The Ninth didn't vanish into legend. They were buried by it. Their defeat was real, their silence deliberate. And now their story stands as a reminder. Power rewrites the past, but truth waits patiently beneath the earth. In 2025, we stopped asking what if, and finally heard what history refused to say.